Whenever somebody mentions Jurassic Park, it's usually acknowledged as being a massively successful film series that started with Spielberg's 1993 film. The movies have become wildly popular, and it's hard to not associate these films with how we view the entirety of the brand. However, those stories are far from being the only titles that have shared that iconic logo. No, in reality, Michael Crichton's 1990 novel and its sequel, The Lost World, is where this property got its first proper breath of life. And those humble beginnings come with some pretty different takes on the series, to say the least. Honestly, the movie series has never really gone as hard-edged and brutal as Crichton's books did. That being said, one of the most obvious differences from these films and their original counterparts happen to be the kills themselves. And due to the fact that barely anybody seems to talk about them, I thought I'd take the opportunity to dive into the material and list all of the most brutal and memorable ways people go out in the books. So without further ado, here are the top 10 deaths in the Jurassic Park novels. Number 10. Kicking off the list, we're going to talk about Howard King. Now, this character meets a truly grisly end in Crichton's second Jurassic novel, The Lost World. Of course, he's not in the movie, but here he actually gets extremely close to getting back to the boat that brought his team to the island. However, after an incoming storm forces the men on deck to get ready to depart without him, he panics, abandoning his jeep and instead opting to run on foot. Howard King is then assaulted by a herd of pachycephalosaurs before making his way to a little river stream. It's here where he comes face to face with a pack of hunting velociraptors. King runs as fast as he can through the long grass of Isla Sorna just before an animal pounces onto his back and digs its claws into his flesh. Eventually, King relaxes and his mind begins to enter into a dreamlike trance. He hardly notices the pain of teeth bearing into his neck and blood running down his body, even feeling the bones break, but it all just feels like it's happening to someone else. But then you got the other humans on the island who know better. Far away in the high hide, the Gatherer team witnesses the man being torn apart by the vicious dinosaurs. One of the raptors even tears Howard King's head off and holds it in its jaws for a while before dropping it to the ground. This was a death that was pretty gruesome, but happened to end with a little bit of a joke. One of the raptors finds a candy bar inside of the man's clothes and chooses to walk away from the carcass in order to eat it all by itself. Definitely something not many of them get too often on the island, I guess. Now, of course, there was a long grass scene in the Lost World Jurassic Park movie, and it's actually one of my favorite scenes in the whole franchise, but the deaths were nothing like what you'd find in Crichton's book.
I was supposed to shoot a death scene, but there was a big hurricane that tore up all the sets.
Alright, so number 9, Mr. Arnold. And here we have a character that was killed off screen in the 1993 original. Now, in the novel version of Jurassic Park, Mr. Arnold actually walks into the maintenance shed with extreme caution. He even leaves one of his shoes in the door in order to give him some light while he advances. Unfortunately, this shoe invites a young raptor in from outside. It's always the raptors, man. The animal chooses to nudge the object away from the door, which covers the interior of the shed in darkness. Mr. Arnold believes that even though the situation looks grim, there's surely no way for the animal to walk down the large flight of stairs that he used to get inside. But he soon learns the hard way that velociraptors are astonishing jumpers, and once the animal makes its way towards him, it shoves him to the ground before standing on top of him and burying its claws in his chest. The last thing John Arnold does before he dies is open his mouth to scream. This is definitely one of the more memorable kills from the first novel, and it really paints an eerie picture for the reader. This one may not be quite as graphic or visceral as Howard King's death, but it's most definitely darker in tone and suspense. Honestly, it's one of my favorites from the entire book series. I just know Samuel L. Jackson would have loved to do it. He even talked about how his death scene was cut from Jurassic Park and they were scheduled to shoot it. I think Hurricane and Nikki is actually what caused them to abandon it, but could you just imagine Samuel L. Jackson screaming while he's getting attacked by the raptor? It'd be great. Dodgson pointed the box at the animals and turned the dial. A high-pitched shriek filled the air. The Rexes roared in response. Number 8, George Basilton. And here we get into Tyrannosaur territory. After climbing into the Rex nest with Lewis Dodgson and Howard King in order to steal a clutch of dinosaur eggs, George Basilton tries the good old don't move technique on these massive animals. Sadly, it turns out that only works if you're Alan Grant. Now, one of the Rexes shoves Basilton to the ground before moving its snout down to tear at the paleontologist's body. Dodgson hears the blood-curdling screams from the man before he notices something shiny dangling out of the T-Rex's mouth, and it's Basilton's wristwatch. It's connected to a severed arm drooping loose in the dinosaur's jaws. This makes Dodgson turn around and run back out to the Jeep, all the while George's terrible screams echo through the dense woods of Isla Sorna. He isn't getting out of that nest anytime soon. This is possibly my favorite part of the second novel, and it's something that I think makes a really, really cool scene in the book. Honestly, it'd be great in a movie. Thankfully, this dismemberment would eventually sorta get retooled for Ken Wheatley's death in Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom. By far, probably one of the best deaths in the Jurassic World trilogy. Number 7, Lewis Dodgson. Making a pretty brief appearance in the original movie and then being incredibly different in Jurassic World Dominion. This character has not really been done justice. I'm sure if you haven't read the books, you'll be a little surprised to hear that Dodgson was actually the lead antagonist of the second novel. You'll also more than likely find it surprising that he meets his end by means of a baby T-Rex in a scene that's relatively similar to what happens to good old Peter Ludlow in the Lost World movie. After having chosen to hide underneath the cover of a Jeep, Dr. Sarah Harding pushes Lewis Dodgson's leg out from under the car in an effort to signal to the parent T-Rex to come and get him. She does this as a little bit of an act of revenge, seeing as Dodgson had attempted to murder her by throwing her from the boat that sailed over to the island earlier in the story. Once the Rex grabs hold of Dodson's leg, it was over for the Biosyn lackey. He later gets dropped into the nest of the juvenile animal with a broken leg from, the operation in the movie. And look, he gets his body torn into by the little dino and its siblings. One of the animals even takes a bite out of his cheek. Dodgson watches the baby swallow his own flesh before it wraps its jaws around his neck and goes in for the kill. This was a very satisfying end to a very vicious villain, and after having seen how truly cruel the man could be, there's something fitting about having the little dinosaurs do him in on the island. Malcolm even voices his happiness with the parent Rex taking him away in its jaws by saying, "See, there is a god." Number 6, Eddie Carr. Unlike the movie version, Crichton's version of Eddie Carr is actually a much younger mechanic. The film adaptation kind of used Dr. Thorne as the basis for the Spielberg character. Another difference between the books and the films happens to be the way in which Eddie Carr dies. Instead of getting ripped in half by both tyrannosaurs, Eddie Carr is yanked out of the high hide by the same pack of vicious raptors that had just killed Howard King. Once Eddie hits the ground, that was all she wrote. The animals then begin to tear into his body and rip him to shreds in an instant. The terrible sound of his high-pitched scream pierces through to the other side of the radio that Thorne, Harding, and Malcolm are listening in on, and eventually the raptors haul what's left of his body into the jungle like a pile of hungry ants. Look, while this is truly a terrible death that really is effective in the novel, I gotta keep it real with you guys and say that Eddie Carr's death in the film, I don't care. It's like way better than what's written in the novel. You just can't top getting ripped in half by 2 Tyrannosaurus Rexes. I don't care. That's still the greatest death in the movies, if you ask me. Number 5, Ed Regis. Now, here's a character who was cut out from the original movie. Ed Regis is an employee of Jurassic Park who had most of his attributes given to the engine lawyer Donald Gennaro in the film. He's the guy that runs out of the car after seeing the T-Rex and leaves the kids alone in the Crichton novel. While he gets away from the initial dinosaur attack, he later comes face to face with a juvenile Rex that Hammond has had transported to the island. This smaller Rex may only be around 8 feet tall and nowhere near as mean looking as the adult, but that doesn't mean it shouldn't be taken lightly. Regis learns this the hard way after he's shoved to the ground multiple times by the juvenile T-Rex. He awkwardly gets up and tells the dinosaur to go away while the animal stares back at him with a curious look in its eyes. Looking out at the situation, Dr. Alan Grant makes the correct deduction that this dinosaur is simply playing with its food. And sure enough, the Rex eventually pushes Regis down to the ground and begins to tear into its much smaller prey. Dr. Grant hears a terrible scream, suddenly silenced once the juvenile picked its head up, revealing a large hunk of flesh trapped in its jaws. Now, this is a death that is pretty iconic from that first novel, and it's widely talked about quite frequently in the book fandom. Robert Muldoon would later come across what's left of this horrific animal attack and throw a single severed leg into the back of one of the park's gas jeeps. He figured it would be the best way to explain what had gone down to Mr. Hammond.
One of the sad things I said is I've been robbed of my great death scene. He said, well, you may have been robbed of a death scene. You may not have been robbed of a sequel.
Now, that brings us to number 4, John Hammond himself. The man that created Jurassic Park is really quite different in the book than he is on screen. Here, Michael Crichton writes about a character that is essentially a very dark version of Walt Disney, someone who cared more about continuing his project legacy rather than listening to any of the warnings he'd hear around him. Now, after being scared by the recorded voice of a Tyrannosaur roar over his own loudspeakers in the park, Hammond would fall down a steep hill and injure his ankle deep in the jungle. It wouldn't take long for his precious little compies to find him, struggling to get out of the area and over the hill to safety. Unfortunately, the compies get to him after he falls yet again, which results in the little dinosaurs overtaking his body and covering his flesh with tiny poisonous bites. The venom from these little dinosaurs sent Hammond's mind into a euphoric, dreamlike state, almost as if he's taken a good dose of numbing narcotics. Hammond lays motionless at the bottom of the hill, watching his little creations surround him, and eventually, the eccentric billionaire becomes a healthy meal for the dozens of animals that have come to eat him. Of course, this kill would eventually be given to Dieter Stark in the Lost World Jurassic Park, after the drafts of the Jurassic Park screenplay kind of changed Hammond away from being more dark and sympathetic. Personally, I prefer nice, misguided Grandpa Hammond to the vicious, mean-spirited guy in the novel, but man, I gotta admit, he did have a pretty great death scene. Number 3, Dennis Nedry. Now we're getting pretty graphic. Dennis Nedry's death in the original novel is radically different to what went down in the first movie. Sure, it starts off relatively similar, with Nedry being stalked by a Dilophosaurus in the jungles of Isla Nublar. However, in the novel version, the dinosaur is actually like 10 feet tall and has a far more menacing appearance than the cute little animal from the movie. After spitting venom in Nedry's eyes, the dinosaur walks over to the man and cuts him across the belly, literally spilling his intestines. After that, Dennis falls onto the foot of the animal before it bites onto the sides of his head and lifts him up into the air. Nedry's last thoughts were that he'd hoped the pain would all be over soon. In the movie, we simply see the Dilo appear in the Jeep next to Dennis, not sure how he got in there by the way, before it begins to rock the inside of the vehicle. While I am a fan of both scenes, I will admit that it would be pretty incredible to see this in a movie, and incredibly difficult for them to put this in the same movie that had the beautiful Brachiosaurus reveal earlier. Nevertheless, this is definitely a scene that many novel fans have discussed for years and years now, and it's absolutely one of the most memorable moments from Michael Crichton's first Jurassic Park. Number 2, the newborn. So, in my opinion, this is by far the most disturbing death in the entire Jurassic Park franchise. I actually don't really like talking about it much anymore. So, there was a newborn baby that was left unattended in a small Costa Rican house, and a pack of a ravenous Compsognathus soon make their way inside of an open window to capitalize on the situation. The startled midwife arrives just in time to see bloodied dinosaurs scurrying away in the darkness. This entire death and everything that surrounds it could never be accomplished in the first movie. In fact, I don't even know if they would want to adapt this into a movie. But I will say that one of the things that it deals with is a subplot of dinosaurs getting off of the island, which was a big part of the first book, and we didn't really see that happening until the sequels. You know, the beginning and the end of the original Jurassic Park novel makes a clear point about the chaos that these animals will cause now that they're free in the wilds of the mainland, and the death of someone this innocent being so gruesome and serious, like, it was a demonstration of the horrors that InGen had created. Out of all of the other terrible ways to go in the Jurassic Park series, the death in this scene is still one of the most scary and iconic moments from the first book. I remember reading it at 11 years old being like, wow, didn't expect that.
Just killed people, Henry.
That's unfortunate.
And then that brings us to number 1, Dr. Henry Wu. Oh, Dr. Wu, you were done so dirty in Dominion. Now look, Dr. Wu plays a prominent role in the first Jurassic Park book. He was overly ambitious and took quite a lot of pride in his work. Nearly every scene he had dedicated to him went on and on about how miraculous his genetic engineering was in the island. Suffice it to say, this would lead to the character's downfall in the book. After learning that the Velociraptors could reproduce, Wu was not upset or saddened or frightened in the least, and instead, he was actually proud. He was proud that his work had produced an animal that could replicate itself without any issues whatsoever. In his mind, he'd created the ultimate life form. This train of thought would later be cut short though, once he ran outside to try and lead Dr. Ellie Sattler back into safety. In doing so, a pack of raptors would actually yank him out of the doorway and tear into his body while he lay flat on his back. Similarly to Nedry, the animals would tear his intestines out, only this time the raptors would actually pull on them and tear them out, while the rest of his exposed flesh would become slashed, shredded, and bitten by the multiple pack mates. Wu tried his hardest to use his hands to push back on the snouts that tore into his body, but unfortunately it would be way too late for him to make any sort of comeback. His ultimate creations would tear him open, and he was indeed alive when they started to eat him. Now I hope, and I mean I really hope, that someone brings Dr. Wu back in a sequel and has him go through this in a new movie. I cannot believe the writers did not give us Dr. Wu's death scene from the books. In the first movie, bro, Dr. Grant is talking about it like as a foreshadowing to scare the kid at the dig site. We were robbed, homies. Anyways, guys, what do you think? Those are my personal top 10 count list for the deaths of the Jurassic Park novels. Have you read either Jurassic Park or The Lost World before in the past? And if so, what did you think about them? I personally love the books. They're crazy in comparison to the movies because they are definitely rated R. Like the Jurassic Park movies are PG-13. The books not so much. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of cool stuff to go over here. Let me know all of your thoughts and opinions and which one you thought was the most impactful to you when you read the novels in the comments down below. Now, before I go, I want to thank everyone that's helped me build my channel over the years. I'd also like to thank every one of you guys who've watched my stuff. You've all been extremely cool to me. If you enjoyed the video, I'd appreciate a like and hope that you'll consider subscribing. God bless you all. Christ is King. See you guys in the next video. And as always, take it easy.